Hey, my name is Owen Reed. I'm 33. I build furniture for a living in Savannah, Georgia. And on a Thursday night in October, I stood up in the nicest restaurant in this city and told the biggest lie of my life. Maybe 60 people in that room, candles on every table, a piano in the corner, and in the middle of all that quiet, a woman I had never met was standing beside her chair with her purse open and her face burning red, while a manager in a black suit told her, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that her card had been declined for the third time. Her grandmother sat at the table in a lavender dress with a little paper crown on her head because it was her 80th birthday, looking down at her lap like she wanted to disappear through the floor. And I heard myself say it before I decided to. 3 words. That's my wife. I put my napkin on the table, walked across that dining room past 60 people who were suddenly very interested in their plates, put my hand on the back of a stranger's chair and said it again, so nobody could pretend they hadn't heard. That's my wife. I've got the bill. I didn't know her name. I didn't know she'd been fired 11 days earlier by the company that owned that restaurant, or that the man at the corner table with a glass of wine was the one who'd fired her, or that in 4 months I'd be sitting in a courtroom while his lawyer tried to prove my marriage was a fraud. All I knew was that I'd seen that exact look on a woman's face before, a long time ago when I was 14 and too scared to stand up. But let me take you back because you need to understand why a quiet man who hadn't spoken more than 4 sentences a day for the last 2 years suddenly opened his mouth in a room full of strangers. My father was a cabinet maker, Reed and Son Woodworks, a brick building on a street with more empty windows than full ones. Workshop downstairs, apartment upstairs, and a sign he painted himself in 1989 with a hand steady enough that the letters still look machine cut. He died 3 years ago, sitting in his chair with the radio on, and left me the building, the tools, and $41,000 in debt he never once mentioned while he was alive. My mother died when I was 14. Cancer, fast, and I don't talk about it much. But there's one night I never got rid of. 4 months before she got sick, she took me to a diner off Abercorn for my birthday. She ordered me a burger and a chocolate shake and ordered coffee for herself, just coffee. And I didn't understand at the time why. When the bill came, her card didn't work. She tried it twice. She said, "Can you try it again, please?" in a voice I'd never heard her use. And the man behind the counter, I still remember he had a pen behind his ear, said loud in front of everybody, "Ma'am, are you going to make me count the change in your purse?" And she opened her purse right there on the counter and started counting out quarters with her hands shaking. And every person in that diner watched her do it, and not one of them said a word, including me. I sat in the booth and stared at the table and let it happen, because I was 14 and embarrassed, and I have carried that shame for 19 years like a stone in my coat pocket. So that's why. Now back to October. The Lantern Room was not my kind of place, but my father's birthday was October 9th, and every year on that date I put on the one jacket I own and go somewhere he would have made a face at and order the steak and sit by myself. It's stupid. It's also the only ritual I have. I was 2 bites in when I heard the manager's voice go from professional to something else. His name was Curtis. I turned in my chair and saw a woman about my age in a dark green dress standing up with a card in her hand, an older woman across from her with white hair and a paper crown, and Curtis saying the word declined like it had a hook on the end of it. And she said quietly, "I have cash, just give me a second," digging in a purse that anyone could see wasn't going to have enough in it. And Curtis said, "Ma'am, the total is $218. And he said it to the room, not to her. That's the part that did it. He said it to the room. I don't remember standing up. I remember the sound of my chair on the floor, and then I was there, and I said it. That's my wife. She turned and looked at me, gray-green eyes wet at the edges, and half a second of blank confusion before something in her face decided to trust me, which I still think was the bravest thing anybody did in that building that night. I looked at Curtis. "I'm sorry. I got held up at the bar. Put it on mine." I handed him a card I knew had exactly enough on it and not much more, and pulled out the empty chair at their table and sat down like I'd been expected. Curtis looked at me, looked at her, looked at the room, which was watching him now instead of her. He walked away, and the old woman in the paper crown reached across the table, put her hand over mine, and said, "Well, I've been waiting a long time to meet you." I laughed. I couldn't help it. Her granddaughter did not laugh. She sat down slowly, folded her hands, and said in the lowest voice I've ever heard anybody use in a restaurant, "What are you doing?" I said, "Eating dessert, apparently." She said, "I don't need rescuing." I said, "I know." I needed to sit down, and that was true, actually. My legs had gone strange on me. So we ate dessert. Her name was Nora Bennett. Her grandmother was Ruth, and Ruth had a way of asking questions that made you answer them before you decided to. Within 20 minutes, she knew I made furniture, lived above my shop, and had been alone for 2 years. Nora barely spoke. She kept her eyes on her plate and her spine straight, and I understood exactly what she was doing because I've done it. She was holding herself together with both hands and couldn't spare one to make conversation. On the sidewalk, Ruth hugged me, an 80-year-old woman hugging a man she'd known half an hour. And Nora said, "Gran, get in the car." And Ruth said, "I am getting in the car. I'm 80, not dead." Then Nora turned around. Under the streetlight, I could see her jaw was tight. "Give me your address," she said. "I'll pay you back. $218 plus tip. I'll bring it in cash." I said, "It's her birthday. Let it be a birthday thing." She said, "I don't take money from men I don't know." And I said, "I'm not a man you don't know. I'm your husband." And I meant it as a joke, and it landed wrong. She stared at me, and then, for 1 second, the corner of her mouth moved, and she said, "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen anybody do." I said, "You're welcome." She said, "It's the only nice thing that's happened to me in 3 weeks." And then she got in the car and drove away, and I walked home in a jacket that was too warm for the night, thinking, well, that's that. I was wrong about that in a way I still don't have words for, because somebody had been filming. A woman 2 tables over had her phone out the second Curtis raised his voice, and she posted 40 seconds of it. Curtis saying $218 to the room, Nora standing there with her purse open, and then a man in a brown jacket walking into frame and saying, "That's my wife." By Monday, it had 4 million views. My father's sign was in a screenshot on the local news, and there were 19 voicemails on the shop line. I unplugged the phone and sanded a tabletop for 6 hours, because sanding is the only thing I know that makes the inside of my head go quiet. And at 4 in the afternoon, somebody knocked on the roll-up door, and when I hauled it open, Nora Bennett was standing in the alley with an envelope in her hand and an expression like she was about to be sick. 218, she said, plus 40 for the tip. Count it. I said, "I'm not counting it." She said, "Count it, please." And I understood she needed me to, so I counted it. "Okay," I said, "it's counted." She didn't leave. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, looking at the half-built dresser, my father's bandsaw with his initials scratched into the housing. Then she said, without looking at me, "You need to take the video down." I said, "It's not mine. I didn't post it." She said, "I know. I've been trying for 4 days." And then she told me she'd worked for Vance Hospitality Group for 6 years, the last 2 as a floor supervisor, which is a title they give you instead of a raise. In August, she noticed the tip pool numbers weren't matching the credit card slips. Not by a lot. 4% here, 6% there, spread across 31 employees and 52 weeks, which if you do the arithmetic, and she did, on graph paper at her kitchen table for 3 weeks, comes to a number with 6 figures in it. She went to Curtis. Curtis told her she was reading it wrong. She went to the district manager, who told her to put it in writing. She put it in writing. 11 days before her grandmother's birthday, she was called into an office and told her position had been eliminated in a restructuring and that her final 2 paychecks would be processed on the normal cycle, which is a phrase that means nothing and buys them 90 days. She had $400. Her rent was $1,100. Her grandmother's apartment was another 8, and Ruth's Social Security covered half of that, and Nora had covered the other half every month for 4 years without ever mentioning it. So the card declined, she said, because there was nothing on it, and I knew there was nothing on it. And I took her anyway because she's 80 and she's been talking about that restaurant since 1997. And I thought I could. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I thought I could figure it out at the table. I didn't say anything. She looked up at me. And then you stood up. Yeah, in front of Preston Vance. I said, "Who?" And she said, "The man in the corner. Gray hair, wine. He owns the company." I remembered him because he hadn't looked away. Everybody else had found something fascinating on their plate, and he'd sat there with his glass halfway to his mouth, watching me like weather coming in off the coast. Nora said he filed something on Tuesday. Vance is claiming I'm a disgruntled former employee who fabricated the numbers to extort a settlement. And now 4 million people have watched a video of me not being able to pay a bill, which their lawyer is going to use to show exactly how desperate I am and exactly how much I need money. She let out a breath. So, that's what your good deed did. I stood there in my own shop and felt the floor tilt a little. I said, "I'm sorry," and she said, "Don't be. That's not why I came." I waited. She said, "I came because I'm about to ask you for something, and I've been standing in that alley for 11 minutes trying to make myself do it." If you have ever been the person who would rather go without than ask, you understand. 11 minutes in an alley to ask a stranger for something. She said, "The eviction is on the 15th. Both of us. I'm on her lease as a co-signer, and once I go, she goes." She swallowed. "I need somewhere for Gran to sleep for 6 weeks. Not me. I'll figure me out. Just her. She's 80. She has a bad hip, and she cannot sleep in a car." And I said, "There's an apartment upstairs." She said, "I heard. I looked it up. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a rate." I said, "It's 2 bedrooms." She said, "I heard that too." Neither of us said anything for a long time. Outside the shop, a truck went by, somebody's radio. I looked at my father's bandsaw and thought about a diner off Abercorn and a woman counting quarters, and then I said the second stupidest thing I've ever said out loud. "Take it, both of you, free for 6 weeks, and then we'll talk about a rate." She said, "Absolutely not." I said, "Then work it off. I haven't invoiced a client in 5 months. I've got a shoebox of receipts and a checkbook I'm scared of. You did that tip pool on graph paper and got it right. Fix my paperwork and we'll call it even, and I'll sleep in the shop." She said, "You are not sleeping in your own shop." I said, "It's got a cot. My dad slept down here for 20 years whenever my mother was mad at him." And Ruth, who had, I learned later, been sitting in the car at the end of the alley the whole time with the window down, called out, "Nora Grace, say thank you to the man." They moved in on a Saturday. It took 2 trips in my truck, which tells you everything about how much 2 women had left after 4 years of one of them quietly paying for both of them. A bed frame, a rocking chair, 11 boxes, and a sewing machine from 1962 that Nora carried up the stairs herself and would not let me touch. That first week, we were extremely polite to each other. She left the rent money I'd refused in an envelope on my workbench. I put it back under her door. This went on until Ruth intercepted the envelope and spent it on groceries, which ended the argument in a way neither of us could object to. The apartment upstairs smelled like sawdust and lemon oil, and by Wednesday it smelled like onions and thyme, and on Thursday I came up the stairs at 7 because Ruth had banged on the floor with her cane, which she informed me was the doorbell now, and there was a plate at the table with my name on a piece of masking tape stuck to it. I said, "You don't have to feed me." Ruth said, "Sit down, Owen," so I sat down, and that was the beginning of the strangest, warmest 4 months of my life. Here's what a fake marriage looks like when nobody's planning it. It looks like a woman with a spreadsheet open on my kitchen table at 11 at night, saying, "You charged the Hargroves $1,900 for a table that took you 210 hours. It looks like me saying, "It's a table." It looks like her saying, "It's $9 an hour, Owen." It looks like her rebuilding my pricing in 4 days. then sitting there while I made the first phone call and mouthing the word don't when I started to apologize. It looks like Nora coming down to the shop at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep, sitting on an overturned bucket with a blanket around her shoulders, watching me plane a board and saying nothing for 40 minutes, and then saying, "My mother left when I was 9." Just like that, in the dark, over the sound of a hand plane. She wasn't a bad person, she just couldn't do it. Gran raised me, and I decided somewhere around 11 that I was never going to be the kind of person who needed somebody to stay, because then nobody could leave. I stopped planing, she said. That's why I stood in the alley for 11 minutes. I said, I know. She said, how do you know? And I told her about the diner, about my mother and the quarters and the man with the pen behind his ear, and how I have replayed that night 1,000 times, and in every version I stand up, and I never did. Nora didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, so you weren't standing up for me? And I said, no, I was. It's just that I've been practicing for 19 years. She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. And then she put her face in the blanket, and I realized she was crying. And I did the thing my father would have done, which was to keep working and let her have it in peace. 2 weeks later, the first envelope came, not to her, to me. A law firm on Bull Street, thick paper, raised letters, informing me that Vance Hospitality Group was aware Ms. Nora Bennett was residing at my address, that in light of the public representation made on the evening of October 9th, they would be seeking clarification of our marital status in discovery, and that any misrepresentation to a court regarding a material relationship could constitute fraud. I read it 3 times, then walked upstairs, put it on the table in front of her, and watched her go white. Her legal aid attorney, a tired good man named Marcus Doyle, explained it in a room with fluorescent lights and a water cooler that clunked. Vance's strategy wasn't to win the wage case. It was to make Nora untrustworthy. If they could show she'd lied publicly about being married, that the whole restaurant scene was staged, that she'd invented a husband to get out of a bill, then every number on her graph paper became the arithmetic of a liar. It's not about the law, Marcus said. It's about what a jury believes about her character. Nora said, so what do we do? And Marcus said, well, you could not have lied. There was a silence in that room I've thought about a great deal since, because there were 2 ways out. One was to go on the record and call it a stranger's impulse, a kindness, a mistake, and hand Preston Vance a video of a desperate woman and a man who'd invented a marriage in front of 60 witnesses. The other was, I said it. I said, or it stops being a lie. Nora turned and looked at me like I'd suggested we set the building on fire. Marcus took his glasses off. I'm going to step out for coffee for about 10 minutes, and I'd like both of you to think very carefully. He left. The water cooler clunked. Nora said no. I said, okay. She said, do you understand what you just offered? Do you have any idea? I said, it's a signature and a courthouse and $11. She said, it's a marriage, Owen. I said, it's also health coverage. Ruth needs that hip done, you know it, and you can't afford it, and I've got a policy my dad set up in 1994 that I've been paying into for 3 years for exactly one person. Her mouth opened and closed. I said, it's not romantic. Separate rooms, separate lives, and if it ever stops being useful to you, you walk and I'll say whatever you need me to say. She said, and what do you get? And I gave her the honest answer, which I hadn't planned on. I said, somebody bangs on the floor with a cane at 7 o'clock. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, that's the worst reason to get married I've ever heard. I said, it's better than most of them. We were married 8 days later in a courthouse on a Tuesday morning by a magistrate who had a cold. Ruth was one witness, Marcus was the other, and he stood there with his briefcase in both hands, looking like a man watching 2 people jump off a bridge. Nora wore the dark green dress. I noticed. I didn't say anything. When the magistrate got to the part about rings, I took out a ring because I'd bought one because I am apparently incapable of doing anything halfway, and Nora's whole face changed. It was $31, silver and plain, with one very small stone the man at the shop admitted was not much of anything. She held out her hand, and it was steady, and I slid it on, and then the magistrate said the words, and we looked at each other, and there was a pause that went on about 2 seconds too long, and she leaned in and kissed me on the corner of the mouth, fast, like pulling a bandage. And Ruth said, "Oh, for heaven's sake," and clapped anyway. We didn't talk about it in the truck. That night, I sat on the cot in the shop with my boots on and stared at the wall for an hour, because somewhere between the alley and the courthouse, something had happened to me that I did not have permission to feel. Here's what November looked like. Marcus filed the amended complaint. 3 more employees came forward, a line cook named Tomas Reyes and 2 servers, and 2 of them uncame forward within a week because Vance Hospitality had 31 restaurants in 4 states, and people have rent. The one who stayed was Delia Ramos, 54, 11 years in, with a daughter in nursing school and every reason on earth to keep her head down. Then things started happening to me. A city inspector came out about a loading zone that hadn't been a problem in 34 years. A supplier I'd used since I was 19 needed payment up front. And the Hargroves, my biggest client, canceled a $14,000 commission with an apology so awkward I felt sorry for the man. He said, "It's a small city, Owen." That's all he said. Nora found me in the shop that night on the bucket. She'd been crying and hiding it, which she was bad at. She said, "I'll leave. If I'm out of the building, they've got no reason to." I said, "Sit down." She sat down. And I said, "I want you to hear me. I have been in this shop by myself for 3 years. Nobody came. Nobody knocked. I ate standing up over that sink. I pointed at it. 4 months ago, a woman I'd never met opened her purse in a restaurant, and I got to stand up. And I have not had one bad day since, not one. So if Preston Vance wants to take a $14,000 table off me, he can have it. He's not taking the rest." She said very quietly, "You shouldn't say things like that to me." I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because I'm starting to believe them." And she got up and went upstairs, and I stood there in the middle of my own shop holding a chisel like an idiot. 2 days before Christmas, Preston Vance came to see me, no lawyer. He parked a car in my alley that cost more than my building and walked into my shop in a camel coat, looking at my father's sign like he was appraising it. He ran a hand along the edge of a walnut sideboard. "Mr. Reed, you make beautiful things. I want to be direct with you because I think you're a direct man." I said, "All right." He said, $90,000, signed release, no admission, everybody walks away. She keeps her dignity, you keep your business, your father's name stays on that sign. He said the last part the way a man drops something heavy on a table to see if it breaks. I said, "Why are you telling me instead of her?" And Vance smiled and said the sentence that decided the rest of it. "Because women in her position take the money, and men in yours make them." I said, "Get out of my shop." He said, "The offer expires Friday." I said, "So does my patience, and I've got about 4 seconds of it left." He left, and I stood there shaking, and then I went upstairs and told Nora every word, including the last one, because I had promised myself I'd never manage her. She listened, she sat down at the table, and then she said something I wasn't ready for. She said 90,000 would pay for Grand's hip. Ruth, from the rocking chair, without opening her eyes, said, "Ruth's hip will hold." Ruth's hip did not hold. It happened on the 9th of January at 6 in the morning in the 6 feet of hallway between her bedroom and the bathroom. I heard it from downstairs, not the fall, the sound after it, which was Nora's voice saying "Gran" in a register I hope I never hear again. By the time I got up those stairs, Nora was on the floor with her grandmother's head in her lap, saying, "I'm here, I'm right here," over and over, and Ruth was gray and trying to apologize. Femoral neck fracture, surgery that night. And because of a marriage license signed by a magistrate with a cold and a policy my father set up in 1994, Ruth Bennett went into that operating room as a covered dependent instead of a bill nobody could pay, and I have never been so grateful for a piece of paper. We sat in that waiting room for 5 hours. Vending machine coffee, a television bolted to the ceiling playing a cooking show with the sound off. Around 1, Nora stopped pretending to read the pamphlet she'd been holding upside down and said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be kind about it, because if you're kind about it, I won't get through it. I said, okay. She said, when I was 9, my mother stood in the doorway of my bedroom with a bag over her shoulder, and she said, I'll be back Sunday. And I said, okay, and I went back to sleep. She was looking straight ahead at the wall, and I've spent 20 years being the person who never needs anybody, because if you don't need them, they can't do that to you. I built my whole life out of that. I paid Gran's rent for 4 years and never told her because I didn't want her to feel like she needed me either. I stood in your alley for 11 minutes. She stopped. Her hands were shaking. And in 4 months, you have taken that entire building apart, board by board, and you didn't even notice you were doing it. I said, Nora, she said, I told you not to be kind. And then she said it, I'm in love with you, and I need you to know that it isn't gratitude, because I've checked about 900 times at 2 in the morning on that bucket in your shop. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. You said if it ever stopped being useful, I could walk. It stopped being useful a long time ago. I'm still here. The cooking show went to a commercial. A nurse walked past. I sat in a plastic chair at 1 in the morning and understood I had exactly one chance to say this correctly. So I said, I bought the ring the week after the restaurant. She turned her head. Before the letter, before any of it, I told myself it was so the thing would look real if anybody asked, and I want you to know that was a lie. And I knew it was a lie standing in the store. I said, I have been in love with you since you counted that money on my workbench and made me count it back, because I knew right then that you'd rather bleed than owe anybody anything. And I thought, God help me, I know exactly what that feels like, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being the exception. She was crying. I said, You're not a fake wife. You're the only good thing that's happened to this family in 3 years, and there's only one of us left in it, so I'd know. And Nora Bennett leaned across the arm of a plastic hospital chair and kissed me for real at 1:15 in the morning under a television playing a cooking show with the sound off. And if you have ever waited a very long time for something and then had it arrive in the least romantic room in the world, you'll understand exactly what I mean. At 2:40, a surgeon came out and told us the pin had gone in clean and Ruth would be walking inside a week. And Nora put her forehead against my shoulder and stayed there. Ruth, when she woke up, wanted to know whether they'd cut off her good nightgown and whether we'd finally quit being ridiculous. We told her about the second one. She said, It's the anesthesia. Don't get used to it. The trial started in March in a courtroom on Montgomery Street with radiators that banged. Judge Alicia Ford. Vance had 3 attorneys and a box of exhibits with color-coded tabs. We had Marcus, one accordion folder, and Ruth in the second row with a cane across her knees like a weapon. They went after the marriage first, exactly like Marcus said they would. Their lead attorney, a smooth man named Ellis Trask, put me on the stand on the second day. Mr. Reed, is it true you had never met Ms. Bennett before October 9th? Yes. Is it true that when you announced to a room full of strangers that she was your wife, the statement was false? Yes. Is it true you married her 11 weeks later after receiving a letter from this firm regarding her marital status? Yes. He turned to the jury with his eyebrows up. So the marriage was, in the most literal sense, manufactured to survive litigation. Mr. Reed, would you agree that this marriage is a fiction? And this is the part I'd been thinking about for 4 months. I said, No, sir. He said, You've just testified. I said, You asked if the sentence was false when I said it. It was. I said it anyway. And then I spent every day since making it true, and I'd say that's the opposite of a fiction. That's a promise with the paperwork done late. Somebody in the gallery laughed. Judge Ford didn't tell them not to. Trask said, Isn't it convenient that you fell in love with a woman who needed your insurance? And I said, It's not convenient at all, sir. It cost me a $14,000 commission, a supplier I'd had for 14 years, and $900 in fines over a loading zone that stopped being legal the same week your client's name came up. If I were doing this for convenience, I'd have taken the 90,000 he offered me in my own shop 2 days before Christmas. The room changed. Trask said, "Move to strike." Judge Ford said, "Denied." "Counselor, you opened that door with a crowbar." And then Marcus stood up and did the thing he'd been building for 5 months. He put Delia Ramos on the stand and let her talk for 40 minutes about 9 years of a tip pool that never once came out even. And she said the thing I've never forgotten: "I'm not doing this for her. I already did 9 years of it." He put Tomas Reyes on, who had kept, because his mother told him to keep everything, a shoebox of his own printed slips going back to 2017. Then he called a forensic accountant who had been through Vance Hospitality's own subpoenaed payroll files and put a single chart on the screen: 31 restaurants, 6 years, a number with 6 figures in it, and then a comma, and then some more. It matched Nora's graph paper to within $400. Trask fought it hard for 3 days, but there's a moment in a room like that when everybody stops pretending, and it came on a Thursday afternoon when Marcus asked Preston Vance one question. He said, "Mr. Vance, on December 23rd, did you go to Mr. Reed's workshop and offer him $90,000? And Vance said, "I made a good faith settlement overture." And Marcus said, "To whom?" And Vance said, "To the household." And Marcus let that sit there. He let the word household sit in the middle of that courtroom in front of 12 people, and then said nothing further, and sat down. The jury was out 6 hours. They came back Friday at 11:40. Wage theft, willful, retaliatory termination, back pay for Nora, back pay for Delia, and a class certification for 240 other employees across 4 states that would take 3 more years and cost Vance Hospitality more than every table I will ever build in my life. Nora didn't cry. She sat perfectly still with her eyes closed and both hands flat on the table, and I watched 20 years of a woman holding herself together finally set something down. In the hallway afterward, Vance passed us. He didn't look at me. He looked at Nora. "You know this won't change anything." And Nora, who 11 days after being fired had stood in a restaurant with her purse open in front of 60 people, looked back and said, "It changed Delia's daughter's tuition. That's enough." That was the last time either of us spoke to him. So, what's left? Ruth walks without the frame now. She uses the cane for effect and to point at things, and still bangs on the floor at 7 o'clock. The Hargroves called back in June, embarrassed, and I built the table, and I charged them properly this time, because I have a wife who does the books. We hired Tomas after the Lantern Room let him go for testifying, and it turns out a man who can run a line on a Saturday night can also finish a drawer front. The sign out front still says Reed and Son. She wanted to change it. I said no. My father put those letters on by hand in 1989, and I'm not touching them. But there was room underneath, and underneath it now says Bennett Reed Woodworks, established 1989, reestablished 2024. We got married again in April in the alley behind the shop, which we swept and strung with lights and filled with about 40 people. Nora wore the dark green dress because I asked her to. Ruth walked her down 11 feet of cracked asphalt, handed her over, and said, "Don't make me do this twice more." When it came time for the vows, I didn't have anything written because I'd tried 9 times and it kept coming out wrong. So I just said what happened. I said, "The first time I called you my wife, I was lying, and there were 60 people in the room, and not one of them believed me. And I've spent every day since trying to be the man who was telling the truth." And Nora said hers with her hand around mine and her chin up. "You didn't rescue me. I want everybody here to know that, because he'll tell it wrong for the rest of his life. He didn't rescue me. He just stood up. That's all he did. He stood up in a room where nobody else would, and it turns out that's the whole thing. That's the entire thing. Sometimes, late, when the shop is quiet and there's sawdust in the light, and I can hear Ruth's television through the ceiling, and Nora on the stairs with 2 cups of coffee she's about to pretend she made for herself, I think about a 14-year-old boy in a diner off Abercorn who sat still and said nothing while his mother counted quarters. I can't go back and fix that night. I've stopped trying. But I've learned that shame like that doesn't go away when you forgive yourself. It goes away when you finally stand up somewhere else. I told a lie in a restaurant on the 9th of October in front of 60 people. 3 words. It was the only dishonest thing I've ever done, and I've spent the rest of my life making it the truest sentence I know.